A dialect is something that is a... Keep going, sorry. Hi, and welcome to the Babbel channel. I'm Jennifer, an instructional designer and linguist here at Babbel's headquarters in Berlin, Germany. Today we're going to be talking about how everyone speaks in dialect. What do I mean by speaks in dialect? Don't I speak a language? Well, yes and no. We have to define some of these terms a little bit to understand what it means to speak in dialect. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily speaking differently than you would speak normally. No. A language is actually an abstract concept. It's a target. So when we talk about speaking English, we have this idea of English as a concept and we try to aim for it. However, everyone produces language a little bit differently. And what actually comes out of our mouths when we speak is a variety of English. It's a dialect. Now, there are two terms that tend to be used interchangeably, accent and dialect. And while they're related, they're not actually the same thing. An accent is simply a different way of pronouncing something. So if I put the stress on the first syllable versus the second syllable, if I pronounce the R at the end of a word or don't, that helps to define an accent. A dialect is a bit more involved. Pronunciation and accent is certainly part of it, but it's not the only part. A dialect has generally its own grammar rules, or at least some grammar differences from other dialects that it's related to. It may have completely different idioms. It may also have different vocabulary, so different terms for common everyday items. So two examples that most of us would be familiar with, dialects of English, would be British English and American English. They are two different varieties of English, not necessarily perhaps separate languages. Some of the vocabulary differences that you might see, well, I'm wearing one of them right now, actually. I would call this a sweater in American English, yet my friends from the UK might refer to this as a jumper. Is one right or wrong? Definitely not. They're just different words that we use to describe different things. It's one of the markers of a dialect. There's also sometimes grammatical differences in dialects. A collective noun is a single word that usually refers to a group of items or potentially a group of people. So for instance, referring to a team. Most American speakers of English would refer to the team is. In other words, the team, although comprised of many people, is a singular item. Whereas people in the UK might refer to the team as a collective in the sense of many people and therefore requiring the plural, the team are. Dialects also tend to be relatively predictable with regard to where someone finds it. They often are located in geographically isolated areas or geographically concentrated areas where a community of speakers all live and interact with each other. Although some dialects could also be socially conditioned. So for instance, you might see it among social classes but spread among a very wide or dispersed geographic area. So in actuality, most people don't speak a language per se, but rather a dialect. So they speak one variety of a language. But who decides then what's called a language and what's called a dialect? Who has that power? Well, a linguist named Max Weinreich coined a phrase that has become a pretty popular answer to this question, where he said, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Of course, he's implying here that there are political or maybe social or even military reasons why one dialect would be called a language, while other dialects are just other dialects. And maybe in some respects, he's correct. If you consider the pre-1990s Yugoslavia, approximately 17 million people living in the nation of Yugoslavia spoke a single language, referred to either as Serbo-Croatian or Croato-Serbian. And after the breakup of Yugoslavia, suddenly no one spoke this language anymore, and instead people spoke Bosnian and Serbian and Croatian and Montenegrin, and it's not like they woke up one day and suddenly didn't understand each other. It was originally the same language. But yet, because of political reasons, those languages became separate in the minds of the people who spoke them. And potentially, over time, they may change. But as of right now, they are pretty mutually intelligible, which means that the speaker of Serbian and the speaker of Croatian can more or less understand each other. So then maybe actually the difference between dialects and languages has to do with mutual intelligibility. But perhaps that's not always the case either. Because take the instance of Chinese. Chinese is a national language, and yet Mandarin and Cantonese are considered by the Chinese government to be two separate dialects of Chinese. However, they are not mutually intelligible. They may share a writing system or elements of a writing system, but yet the spoken language is not understandable by speakers of the other dialect. So wouldn't it just be easier if everyone spoke the same dialect? What's the purpose of having different dialects? Why is it something that we want to recognize or celebrate or even protect when some small dialect communities start to get smaller or dwindle in size? Well, there's potentially an advantage to having different dialects. Why? Because one of the ways that we signal to other people that we're communicating with that we are part of the same community, that we are someone to be trusted, that we are someone who can empathize with them, is often by the way we speak. And therefore, our dialect actually tags us as a member of a community. And therefore, it's a way to feel cohesive and to feel connected to the other people in your community. A recent study, just published in 2019, actually showcased how a dialect forms over a relatively short period of time with isolated communities. The study tracked people that were living part-time, temporarily, in the Antarctic in an isolated community where they had to cooperate with each other and, of course, were not having any sort of contact with people outside of the community due to the harsh conditions. What the researchers noticed was that over a relatively short period of time, tiny changes in the way that the people spoke within the communities became widespread and adopted by the entire community. These changes, although small in the beginning, were amplified because the community was relatively isolated. Over the course of time, researchers were able to see that the way that the people spoke after these periods of time isolated in the Antarctic were fully embedded in their new dialect. If you want to learn a little bit more about the study with the Antarctic communities, the link is in the description below. And if you're interested in how language changes, check out my other video on how Hollywood changed American English. So, what's the favorite thing about your dialect? What do you love about the way things are pronounced, or maybe the idioms you have? Maybe there's a particular grammar construction that you really like, that you love repeating. Tell me all about it in the comments below. If you like this video and want to see more, click subscribe. See you next time.